Hi, my name is Hiroshi, and this is Hiroshi Lawns. Yes, I know, it says lawns, and we're about to spend the next half hour on a fence. My editor has already sent me 3 angry messages. We'll deal with that later. Here's the real question. How does a wooden fence in rural Japan stand for 80, 90, even 100 years with no paint, no stain, and no sealant ever touching it, while the fence in your backyard is peeling and rotting after one winter? The answer is an 800-year-old technique, and today I'm going to show you exactly how to use it on your own fence. The problem with your fence. Now, before I get 100 comments asking why Hiroshi Lawns is making a video about a fence and not a lawn. Yes, I see you, I know. My own brother sent me a screenshot of the channel name with a question mark on it. Here's the thing. A fence falling apart at the edge of your yard makes the whole yard look bad, lawn included. So, today, the lawn is fine. It's the fence that's the problem, okay? Moving on. Picture the fence in your backyard right now. Maybe you painted it 3 summers ago, and already the paint is curling up at the edges like old wallpaper. Maybe you went with a stain instead, and now half the boards are a warm honey color, and the other half are gray and splintery because the sun hits one side harder than the other. Maybe nobody has touched that fence since it went up, and it just looks tired. Silver gray, soft at the bottom of every post, a little spongy if you press your thumb into it. You've probably tried the obvious fixes. A new coat of paint over the old one. A weatherproofing spray from the hardware store that promised 10 years of protection and gave you maybe 2. Pressure washing it every spring to make it look new again for about a week. None of that is your fault. It's the method that's wrong. In Japan, there are wooden fences standing right now that were built before your country you even had electricity, and nobody has ever painted them. Not once. So let's fix yours the same way. The 2-part plan. So here's how we're going to do this, in 2 parts. First, we deal with the fence you already have, the peeling paint, the gray wood, the soft rotten spot at the bottom of post number 3 that you've been quietly avoiding for 2 years. We get it back to clean, sound, bare wood. Second, we apply the finish that Japanese carpenters have used for hundreds of years. The one that needs no paint, no stain, and basically no future trips to the hardware store. By the end of this, your fence problem is solved permanently. Let's go. Part 1. Strip, bleach, and fix the rot. Alright, step 1. Grab a paint scraper, a stiff wire brush, and if you've got one, a heat gun. Not to burn anything yet, that's later. Just to soften really stubborn old paint, so it lifts in sheets instead of chipping into 1,000 tiny flecks that get embedded in your lawn, and then your lawnmower throws at your shins for the next 5 years. Ask me how I know. Walk the whole fence and knock off anything that's already loose. Don't try to save it. I know it feels wasteful to scrape off a section that's only half peeled, but here's why that paint failed in the first place, and why it's going to keep failing no matter how many times you patch it. Wood is alive. Even after it's cut into a board, it pulls in moisture when the air is damp and releases it when the air is dry, which means it's constantly expanding and shrinking, sometimes within the same day. Paint is a hard, rigid film. It can't expand and shrink along with the wood underneath it. So every cycle puts a tiny crack in the paint along the grain. Water gets into that crack. The next cycle, the paint around the crack lifts a little more. And every time you add another coat on top, you're adding another rigid layer that has to crack before it can move. 3 coats in, your fence is basically wearing a jacket 2 sizes too small. And every season, it rips itself open trying to breathe. Once the loose stuff is off, sand the rough spots. 60 grit paper first, then 100 grit to smooth the transitions. You're not trying to make it furniture smooth. You're just removing the splinters and feathering the edges where old finish meets bare wood. Now for the gray, weathered boards and the black mildew spots, which is probably most of the fence if it's more than 5 years old. The fix here is 1 cheap powder, oxalic acid, sold at almost any hardware store as wood bleach for around $12 a tub. Mix 4 ounces of the powder into 1 gallon of warm water and spray it on with a garden sprayer on a cool, overcast day. Not blazing sun, because it'll dry on the surface before it can do its job. Here's what's actually happening. Sunlight breaks down a compound inside the wood called lignin, which is basically the glue holding the wood fibers together. Once the lignin near the surface breaks down, the wood turns gray and starts lifting into tiny splinters, and mildew spores move into that damaged layer because it holds moisture. The oxalic acid dissolves that whole damaged layer and lifts it off, and underneath, the original warm color of the cedar is just sitting there like it's been hiding the whole time. Let it sit 15 minutes, scrub lightly along the grain with a stiff nylon brush, and rinse with a hose. The brown runoff is years of weather damage, leaving for good. Last part of step 1, and the part everyone avoids, the post bases. Dig down about 6 inches around any post that's leaning or feels soft. You'll usually find the rot starts right where the wood meets the soil, because that's where moisture sits against the wood 24 hours a day. Brush away the soft, dark wood until you hit something solid. Sound wood feels almost like a different material entirely. Soak that area with copper naphthenate, a green-tinted wood preservative that's been around for decades and actually works, about $20 a quart. Let it dry, then backfill with a small concrete collar poured at a slight angle so water runs away from the post instead of pooling against it. What not to do now. Now, let me say something clearly about pressure washers, because every spring somebody in the comments tells me to just blast the fence clean and be done with it. I get it. It looks incredible for about 10 minutes. The wood goes from gray to bright and clean, water's flying everywhere, very satisfying. The problem is what that pressure is actually doing underneath the surface. A pressure washer drives water deep into the grain of the board, and it strips away the soft, early growth wood between the harder grain lines, which leaves the surface ridged and fuzzy, almost like corduroy. That fuzzy texture holds even more moisture next time it rains. So the fence looks clean for 10 minutes and then spends the next 2 years rotting faster than it would have otherwise. Honestly, just skip it. The oxalic acid wash we just did does the same cleaning job without forcing water where it doesn't belong. While we're here, used motor oil. I know somebody's grandfather swore by brushing old motor oil onto fence posts. And I get the logic. Oil repels water. Fences last forever. Grandpa's fence is still standing. But used motor oil is full of heavy metals and contaminants from the engine, and it leaches straight into the soil around your fence, which is bad for your soil, your grass, your dog, basically everyone except the oil company that already got paid for that oil 30 years ago. Skip that too. And the spray-on lifetime sealants from the hardware store. They're mostly silicone. They sit on top of the wood instead of soaking in. And the moment they start to fail, which is usually within a year or two, you're stripping them off before anything real can go on. None of that is necessary. What we're putting on next works on a completely different principle. Part 2, Yakisugi, the real Japanese method. Okay, now we get to the part that actually deserves to be called Japanese, and the part that justifies the word permanent in the title of this video. The technique is called Yakisugi, sometimes written as Shusugi ban, and it's been used on Japanese homes and fences for somewhere around 400 years. The idea sounds almost too simple to be real. You take a propane torch and you burn the wood on purpose, thoroughly. Here's how it actually works. You run the flame slowly and evenly along the grain of each board on the side that's going to face the weather until the surface turns into a layer of black carbon, somewhere around 1/16 of an inch deep. You're not trying to set the board on fire and walk away. You're moving the flame steadily, like you're toasting a marshmallow you actually care about, until that whole surface is uniformly charred. Then you go over it with a stiff wire brush to knock off the loose, flaky ash, which reveals a tighter, almost alligator skin texture underneath. Finally, you wipe on a thin coat of natural oil. Tung oil works great, with a rag, and let it soak in. That charred layer is the entire weatherproofing system. There's no separate sealant because the wood basically became its own sealant. The carbon blocks ultraviolet light completely, so the sun can't break down the lignin underneath the way it does on unprotected wood. Remember that gray, splintery damage we just spent an hour fixing? That doesn't happen to charred wood, because there's nothing left at the surface for the sun to break down. The carbon layer also repels water, so the wood underneath stays dry. And this is the part that surprised me the first time I read about it. The charred surface is basically inedible to insects and fungus. Nothing wants to eat a piece of charcoal, so you've removed sun damage, water damage, insect damage, and rot, all with one tool, and that tool is fire. A properly done yakisugi finish lasts somewhere between 80 and 100 years. With the only maintenance being a light re-oiling every 10 to 15 years. Let that sink in for a second. Your grandkids will be dealing with this fence, not you. I'll be honest, the first time I tried this on my own fence, I got a little overconfident with a torch on one board, and instead of an even char, I ended up with a section that looked less like elegant Japanese woodworking and more like a campfire mishap. My neighbor came out to ask if everything was okay, which, fair question. The fix was easy. I just went back over it more slowly until the whole board was even. But the lesson is, slow and even beats fast and confident every single time, with fire especially. If the idea of taking an open flame to your fence makes you nervous, and honestly, that's a completely reasonable feeling, there's a fallback. Skip the charring entirely and go straight to the oil. Pure tung oil, rubbed into clean, bare wood along the grain, left to soak for about 20 minutes, then wiped off. It won't last 80 years, but it'll outlast any stain or paint you've ever used. The wood stays able to breathe, and you can redo it on a Saturday afternoon every year without breaking a sweat. The village that never repaints. There's a detail about this technique that I think gets lost every time it shows up in a slick design magazine. Because design magazines like things to look effortless, and this was never effortless. In old farming villages, there's a well-documented example in a mountain region of Gifu Prefecture. The cedar for fences and siding was traditionally felled in winter, when the sap content in the wood is at its lowest. Lower sap means less food for fungus and insects later, and it means the wood dries more evenly. The boards were then stacked outdoors with small wooden spacers between each one, so air could move on all sides, and left to dry for the better part of a year before anyone went near them with fire. Charring itself was often a group event. Neighbors would gather and char a whole batch of boards together in an afternoon, because evenly burning dozens of boards at once is genuinely easier with more hands than with one person and a torch, muttering to themselves, alone, in their backyard. Some of the siding from houses built in that region during the late 1800s is still on those houses today, the same boards, the same char, just re-oiled every decade or so by whoever happens to own the house now. None of that timeline is in the quick tutorials online, but it's the reason the technique has a 400-year track record instead of a 4-year one. The fire is maybe 10% of it. The patience around the fire is the other 90%. When a board keeps failing. A quick word on what to do when one specific board just refuses to cooperate, because every fence has at least one. There's always that one board. You'll know it by the way it makes you sigh every time you walk past it. If you've charred and oiled a board and within a season, it's already cracking along the grain. Not just small surface checks, but real splits. The kind you could lose a coin in. That's usually telling you the wood was still too wet when you charred it. Steam trapped under the surface will force its way out eventually, and it takes the surface with it on the way out, char and all. The fix isn't more oil, and it definitely isn't a second pass with a torch, which I tried once and only made the crack wider and my mood worse. Pull that board, let a replacement dry for a few weeks somewhere covered and ventilated, and redo it properly once it's actually ready. If instead it's the bottom 6 inches of an otherwise perfectly charred board going soft, while the rest of the board still looks fantastic, that's not a charring problem at all, that's a ground contact problem. The char protects the surface from sun and rain, but it doesn't make the wood immune to sitting in wet soil forever, no matter how good it looks up top. That board needs the same fix we did for the posts earlier. Lift it, dry it out. And if it's a picket or rail near the ground, consider a small gravel strip underneath the whole bottom row so nothing sits directly in dirt going forward. One stubborn board doesn't mean the method failed. It means that board has something specific to tell you, and it's usually telling the truth. Let's talk costs. Let's talk costs, because this is usually where people's eyebrows go up. A propane torch kit, if you don't already own one, is around $30 to $40, and it'll last for years of projects. Not just this one. A gallon of pure tung oil is roughly $40 and will finish a fence around 100 feet long with leftovers for next year's touch-up. The oxalic acid wood bleach is about $12 a tub. Copper naphthenate for any rotted post bases is around $20 a quart. A few bags of a quickset concrete for post collars, call it $5 a bag. And you'll need maybe 2 or 3. Add it all up and you're looking at somewhere around $120 total for an average backyard fence, plus a weekend or 2 of your own time. Now compare that to the repaint cycle. A gallon of quality exterior stain runs you $30 to $50, and you need several gallons for a full fence, plus the labor of stripping and prepping every 2 to 3 years, forever. Over just 10 years, most homeowners spend somewhere between $600 and $1,000 on paint and stain alone. And that's before you account for the boards that rotted anyway and had to be replaced, which for an average fence, when it finally gives up completely, runs into the thousands. $120 once versus $1,000 repeatedly forever. I'm not great at math, but even I can see which side of that equation I'd rather be on. Your weekend by weekend plan. Here's how I'd actually spread this out, because doing all of it in one weekend is a great way to end up grumpy and sunburned. Weekend 1, scrape off all the loose failing paint or stain, sand the rough spots, and do the oxalic acid wash on the gray and mildewed sections. Let everything dry for a few days afterward. Don't rush into the next step on damp wood. Weekend 2, handle the structural stuff. Dig out any rotted post bases, treat them. Pour your concrete collars at that slight angle so they shed water. Replace any boards that are cracked all the way through with new cedar. They won't match yet. That's fine. We're about to fix that. Weekend 3, on a dry day, this is your finishing weekend. If you're doing the full yakisugi treatment, char the boards one at a time, slow and even. Brush off the ash and wipe on the tung oil. If you're going the simpler oil-only route, just work your way down the fence with the oil and a rag, section by section. After that, you're basically done for the next decade. Once a year, on a dry day in spring or fall, walk the fence, check the post bases, and give it a light re-oiling if it's looking thirsty. That's maybe 2 hours once a year. Compare that to where you started. The bigger lesson. So here's the thing this video was actually about. Underneath the torch and the oil and all the dollar figures, every fix we did follows the same idea. Stop fighting the wood and start working with what wood actually does. Wood moves, so don't trap it under something rigid. Wood rots where moisture gets trapped, so give that moisture somewhere to go. Wood is only vulnerable to sun and bugs while it's, well, wood. So turn the surface into something that isn't wood anymore, and none of that applies to it anymore. The Western approach has mostly been shaped by companies that need you to buy something again next year. The Japanese approach, at least the version that survived 400 years, was shaped by people who had to live with their own decisions for the rest of their lives and probably hand the fence to their kids too. Your fence does not need to be a project every spring. It needs one good weekend, a torch, or a bottle of oil, and then basically nothing for years. If this helped, subscribe and tell me about your fence disasters in the comments. I read all of them. And next week, against all odds, Hiroshi Lawns is actually going to talk about a lawn. See you then.